Well, hello again, and where's Simon today? You might hear in the background there's a certain amount of selling the cattle going on. I'm in Llandovery livestock market for their monthly cattle sale. There's some very smart cattle have come in here today, and they're making really good money. Now, those of you who spent any time farming or running any sort of business for that matter, you know the truth in your bones. Yes, you need a plan, but you better not assume everything is going to go according to that plan. There's a saying often attributed to Helmut von Moltke the Elder, 19th century Prussian field marshal who served as chief of their general staff. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. Now, von Moltke didn't exactly put it like that, not exactly so memorably. He was saying it in German, of course. The military distilled this lengthy strategic thinking into this French breakfast-sized nugget, but the essence is authentic. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. What he was advocating, of course, was flexible military planning rather than rigid adherence to detailed blueprints. He understood commander must adapt quickly once battle begins, because the fog of war, unpredictable enemy actions, they inevitably disrupt even the best laid plans. And over time, of course, this sharper version we've got has migrated far beyond military context. You'll hear it now in business meetings, project management, seminars, even everyday life. Pithy way of expressing how reality rarely cooperates with our plans and expectations, regardless of how meticulously we've prepared. The core insight remains profoundly valuable. Thorough preparation is essential. Moltke would certainly have believed in that, but equally essential is the capacity to adapt when circumstances inevitably shift. Now, in James chapter 4, verses 13 to 17, James wants to take us deeper than pragmatic flexibility. He's after something more fundamental about why our plans don't survive. And he takes his original hearers to task with remarkable directness. While he seems particularly focused on merchants and business people, in this passage, the principles he derives are meant to be universal, applicable to every one of us, most days. So what exactly is happening in James 4, 13 to 17? Let's have a look then, first of all, at the context. Let me basically set the scene. James 4, 13 to 17 appears in the closing section of a larger argument that runs from chapter 4, verse 1 through chapter 5, verse 6. And the entire section is dominated by a single tension: arrogant self-assertion versus humble dependence on God. Watch how this theme develops. Chapter 4, verses 1 to 10, James rebukes self-seeking quarrels and calls his readers to humility before God. Then chapter 4, verses 11 to 12, he rebukes those who arrogantly judge other people, in effect usurping God's role as judge. Who do you think they are, he says. And then chapter 4, verses 13 to 17, our passage, he rebukes arrogant presumption about the future, people usurping God's sovereignty. And then, next time for us, chapter 5, verses 1 to 6, he delivers his final rebuke to rich oppressors, actually agricultural oppressors, funny enough. The ultimate expression of godless self-security is what's going on there. So our passage then continues this sustained anti-pride theme. It's part of that bigger picture, but it applies to a specific social behaviour: self-confident planning and economic presumption. James is systematically dismantling every form of self-sufficiency you see across these chapters. Self-sufficiency that forgets God. Okay, let me walk you through the passage step by step, because James builds his argument with careful rhetorical precision. Verse 13 opens with James quoting the confident speech of his targets. Today or tomorrow, we'll go to this city, we'll spend a year there, we'll trade, we'll make money. Now notice that's not James' own view, he's dramatising a problem. These are people who make plans as though they control what's going to happen. That's verse 13. Verse 14 delivers the challenge to those people he's just eyeballed. He says pointedly, what is your life? And then he answers his own question. They don't even know what tomorrow will bring. Human life, he tells them, is like a mist, atmos in Greek, that appears briefly and then vanishes. And the point is stark. We're not as certain or as strong as we imagine. That's verse 14. Then verse 15 gives us the heart of James's instruction. Instead of boasting about their plans, they should speak differently. If the Lord wants it, we will live and do this or that. That's what they should say. Now that's not just an empty religious formula, it's a fundamental reorientation of how we understand our agency in the world. You are very much what you tell yourself quite often. He's saying tell yourselves, remind yourselves, everything depends on God's will. And then verse 16. Verse 16 pronounces judgment. You boast in your arrogance, he says, and all such boasting is evil. See, James isn't suggesting a social faux pas. He's not saying this is merely poor etiquette or bad form, chaps. He's identifying this as a moral problem, one that reveals pride and forgetfulness of God's authority. And then, in this quick overview, verse 17 concludes with a wider principle applicable to anybody. Anyone who knows the right thing to do, but doesn't do it, sins. And that moves us from the specific case of presumptuous planning to a universal moral truth about taking responsibility for doing what's right when we know what it's right to do. What have we said? Well, in short then, the passage moves through these three stages. Firstly, people plan their futures with breezy confidence, verse 13. James exposes how limited and fragile their life is and how their control over it really is, that's verse 14. And then he teaches the proper attitude, dependence on God's will, verse 15. He condemns proud self-reliance as evil, verse 16. And then he concludes with a general moral principle, verse 17. And the flow of thought moves deliberately from human pride and self-assurance toward humble trust in God. Okay, let's now dig a bit deeper into specifically what he's saying. Verse 13, there's this vocal summons. Come now, you who say. He's taking people, as it were, by the jacket. It's quite forceful. It's a rhetorical device of a thing called diatribe, moral teaching. We might come back to that. It pivots the reader away from general argument to a biting, envisaged speech. You who say, he's imagining somebody saying, you guys. And it's an imperative phrase signaling a shift in audience focus. It's what scholars call a mini diatribe opening, but you don't get many of them in our village on a weekend. It's a device borrowed from Greek philosophical rhetoric. We'll get to it in a minute. The diatribe format was a way that philosophers and moral teachers like the Stoics and the Cynics and later Jewish Christian preachers, they taught ordinary people how to live wisely and ethically. And it was vigorous, you know. So here James signals out his target demographic, being sure everyone else is listening in to get the general point by the end. And he uses the phrase hoi legontes, you who say, identifying that specific group being critiqued, as if there was a crowd standing around. He goes, you guys. Now, notice James doesn't label them by occupation, not this time, or by social class, but by their speech pattern, characterized by what they say, by the way they talk about their futures. Let's pause here a minute, explore James's rhetorical approach, because understanding how he communicates reveals important lessons, not only about what he's saying, but about how we might communicate truth effectively in our own cultural moment by learning from his. See, James's rhetorical approach in this passage is, well, it doesn't read like a typical letter, let me put it like that. It's not a business letter. It's a miniature wisdom sermon, this oral diatribe, rich in imagery, direct address, sharp rhetorical contrasts. Now, several influences shape that rhetorical mode. Jewish wisdom teaching, prophetic teaching back in the Old Testament. James is standing firmly in a tradition of Jewish teachers who combined wisdom reflection with prophetic admonition. His style shows features typical of wisdom instruction, direct address. Now, you who say, It's the hallmark of a teacher confronting the listener face to face. Get in Proverbs 1:22, for example. And then he quotes his target's presumptuous words to expose their folly. Common move in wisdom dialogues. You can get it in Job 12:2, Malachi 1, verses 2 to 6. And then there's this contrastive correction. Shouldn't be saying that. Instead, you ought to say this. He's shown the wrong way and the right way. Standard wisdom technique for moral instruction. And that's oral, contrastive structure. It gives the passage the feel of a classroom or a synagogue teaching session. It's not private correspondence, it's delivered public exhortation. Like a very practical sermon. It reflects that Jewish wisdom style then, but it also reflects a sort of a Hellenistic diatribe style. And you'd expect that because this is addressed to Jewish people who are living in the Greek world, in the diaspora, as chapter 1 verse 1 tells us. So that's why in chapter 4 verses 13 to 17 we find James adapting to their cultural moment. What he's got there, it bears the distinctive features of Hellenistic diatribe as well as Jewish moral teaching. A form of moral teaching employed by Stoic and Cynic philosophers like Epictetus and Seneca, later adopted by Paul and James. And the characteristic visible features here you'd recognise. There's that direct vocal summons. Hey you, almost he's saying. Similar to what you get in Romans 2:1. You who say. The construction sets up this perhaps little group of fictional opponents whose attitude is being corrected for them. And then you get this rhetorical question. Think about it, he's saying. What is your life? And he follows by an answer and a moral application. And then he brings it to a moral conclusion, the way those philosophers would, ending with a globally applicable maxim. Therefore, anyone who knows the good to do it and doesn't do it sins. See, this is the important thing for us. James's use of this form of writing and speaking, it shows us he's functioning not as a letter writer, but as a moral philosopher, a preacher, confronting the self-assured hearer, exposing folly, steering them towards wisdom. And what makes this approach vivid is the mercantile culture of the Jewish diaspora. Many were traders who travelled to cities to make profit, as verse 13 describes. By presenting a typical merchant speech, today or tomorrow we'll go to this city or that city, James is transforming an everyday social reality into a moral parable. His rhetoric is therefore socially realistic, echoing ordinary business speech, philosophically shaped, structured as a diatribe, theologically grounded, rooted in wisdom's dependence on God. And that fusion gives the passage its unique voice, somewhere between synagogue homily and moral philosophy lecture they could have heard in the public squares in the cities to which they'd all been dispersed. So what a way to communicate. James's rhetorical background, Jewish wisdom teaching, prophetic speech, in the form of Hellenistic diatribe or moral instruction, the method being to expose error by quoting it, refuting it through wisdom reasoning, correct with a God-centered alternative, and conclude then with a universal principle. And its purpose? Not at all to forbid planning, but to reshape the moral imagination, to teach that all planning must acknowledge divine sovereignty and human fragility. But what exactly is this group? Well, again, verse 13. They are the people who are going to say, today or tomorrow we will go, spend a year, trade and make a profit. And what's happening is there's a repeated and in what they're saying. It creates a sense of self-sufficient momentum. We're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to do that, we're going to do that. One action flowing inevitably into the next. And the speech sounds like arrogance. Human self-determination. We're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to do the next thing. Without any reference to their own human weakness and inability or to the divine omnicompetence. Look at the words James puts in their mouths. Verse 13, today or tomorrow we'll go to this or that city, we'll spend a year there, we'll carry on business, and we will make money. Dramatic, direct speech. It's not James's own belief, it's a mock voice, dramatized example of the arrogant planner. But look at the momentum, the sequence of future verbs. We will go, we will spend, we will trade, we will make money. And it just mimics the rhythm of boastful planning. What James pretends to be doing is to capture the overheard speech of a merchant or a travelling trader. Well, let's have a little bit of background, historical social background on the first century mercantile world for a minute, because there was at this point in time a new class of mobile traders. See, by the mid-1st century, the Roman Empire had created a vast and integrated transport system and a vast and integrated economic network based on the Pax Romana. Roman law ran everywhere. There was a stability in being able to go and do business. Roads, ports, common currency allowed ambitious people, especially in the eastern provinces, to engage in mobile commerce. And that description fits a diaspora Jewish context where trade offered economic mobility in the Gentile world. Such traders often enjoyed success, but they also faced a moral tension, independence, profit-seeking, and exposure to cultural compromise. Moral perceptions of these merchants in the ancient world often viewed those traders with kind of respectful suspicion. And while commerce was necessary, it was also morally suspect because it encouraged greed, deceit, and vaunted self-interest. So, for example, Aristotle, in the Politics, he distinguished between natural acquisition, household economy, and unnatural pursuit of gain for its own sake, like these travelling merchants were doing. Philo of Alexandria, Jewish philosopher, contemporary with James, saw trade as dangerous to the soul. That's going a long way, isn't it? Merchants in pursuit of gain, he said, travel far. Forget home and law and the fear of God. And then you get Seneca. He wrote that the desire for profit has led men to cross the seas and defy the elements, and he's disapproving of the whole thing. So James's hearers here, likely small traders and artisans in diaspora communities, would have recognized this social type immediately. Get a bit about it in chapter 2, verses 2 to 7. But it's worth noticing James isn't condemning business itself. He's condemning the moral attitude of presumption that success can be achieved independently of God and his providence. Well, that's what other people were saying about it. But what about James's own critique? See, presumption, not enterprises, is the big issue for James. James's rebuke isn't against planning or profit. Both are affirmed in the wisdom literature, Proverbs 6, 6 to 11, Proverbs 31, 10 to 31. No, James's target is boastful self-determination. We will go, we will spend, we will trade, we will profit. What's missing? There's no reference to God at all. This envisaged speech from the merchants, it embodies autonomous human agency. Self-produced success, time under personal control. The issue is not business planning, but presuming on the future as though it were ours to command. The correction comes in verse 14 around ignorance and fragility. You don't know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You're a vapor. See, James is introducing a sharp rhetorical pivot now. The question, what is your life, functions like an evaluative hinge, swinging from the merchant's confident quotation to James's devastating critique. James deploys two connected moves here. First, he rebukes their ignorance. You who do not know. They've been planning as though they possess knowledge they simply don't have. But secondly, he introduces a metaphor, and the word he uses is atmis, mist or vapor. It's a classical image drawn from Old Testament wisdom, Job chapter 7 verse 7, Psalm 39 verse 5, and it grounds James's appeal in Jewish wisdom tradition. Now let's expand on that misty metaphor because it's absolutely crucial to James's argument. It's the centre of the thing in many ways. That Greek word there, atmis, mist, vapor. It's rare, but it's theologically loaded. James 4:14, it becomes the key image of human frailty. For you are a mist that appears for a short time and then vanishes. That imagery belongs deeply to Hebrew wisdom tradition. In the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, atmis typically translates the Hebrew word hebel, literally breath, vapor, mist. And hebel, vapor, that word, it dominates the book of Ecclesiastes, for example, appearing 38 times. Most famously, starts off early on, doesn't it? Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, says the preacher, Ecclesiastes 1:2. It's a picture conveying the transience and elusiveness of human effort because of the fleeting quality of life. And it shows up the futility of self-assured labour, like these guys are giving vent to in James's imagined discussion. See, James's atmis, in this context, it captures precisely the same philosophical reality. Life is insubstantial, uncontrollable, and temporary. So in Proverbs 27 verse 1, for example, we're going to read, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring." James's point is that because life is like that, wise people plan humbly and with constant reference to the God who does actually control our destiny. Now you get similar ideas in Greek and Roman writing and philosophy and so on. Seneca calls human life tenuis spiritus, a thin breath, easily dissipated. Epictetus uses anthropos as phleoroi kai atmis. Human beings are just a chatter and a vapor, emphasizing the moral shallowness of human self-sufficiency. So James's imagery, again, it's resonating with both Jewish wisdom tradition and the Stoic, cynic moral teaching of the Greek world, where recognizing life's transience served as a spur to moral seriousness rather than despair. So the way this works in James 4:14 then, that word atmis there is going to function as a theological correction to self-confidence. And James deploys this wisdom motif rhetorically, not merely to describe life's brevity, but to undermine the arrogance of those who think they can shape their own futures. Today or tomorrow, we will go and we'll do this and that. So that atmis metaphor then, the mist, the vapor, it's the key unlocking the entire passage itself. It reframes human planning within the limits of mortality and divine sovereignty. But it aligns James with Old Testament wisdom teaching. And he's saying, because human life is as fleeting as a vapor, wise people plan with humility and knowledge and depending on the will of the eternal God, who isn't like that at all. So James's argument moves strategically. We live as humans with twin limitations: the inability to reliably predict the future and the inability to cope with being unable to do so. We stand, as it were, at the cliff edge of uncertainty, gazing down into the fog. But there's a better way that James is trying to persuade us to embrace. Here in verse 15 now, he puts to us the proper spiritual alternative. James writes, "Instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that." Now that's the corrective core of the entire passage. Grammatically, instead of your saying that, you should say this, introduces the contrast. There's a conditional clause that then comes in, if the Lord wills, replaces that previous sequence of confident future verbs. We will do, we will go, we will gain. This isn't simply pious words, a religious formula. It's a speech act that fundamentally reorientates the way you think, from human presumption to conditional dependence on God's will. Because what we tell ourselves actually very often influences what we become. The subject of the verb shifts. The Lord becomes the one whose will determines outcomes. And he's trying to get us to think like that and live like it. This is James's corrective to the merchant's market-oriented, self-sufficient planning. And he's recommending relocated agency in God. God's the one who runs this, not you. It's an intensely practical thing he's saying here. Change your way of speaking, because your speech both expresses and makes what's in your heart. Shaping and revealing your actual moral stance, but making it as well. How we talk about our plans reveals, shapes where we stand in relationship to what we do and how we think of our lives, and also in our relationship to God. Right now, verses 16 to 17. Here's where he gets down to it. Verse 16, he says, "But now you boast in your arrogant pretensions. All such boasting is evil." He's not messing about here, is he? He's making that shift. But now he shifts to a moral evaluation of the preceding behavior he's described. But now he's no longer merely describing. He is pronouncing judgment on what he's observing. He's labeling that prior behavior as vice. Strong term, allotonia. A term deeply resonant in moral philosophy in the Greek world, and denoting pretentious claims of self-sufficiency. The vice directly opposite to modesty, self-restraint, sound-mindedness. You boast in your arrogant pretensions, James declares. And this verse functions then as the rhetorical conclusion to the rebuke, naming the sin explicitly, prideful boasting, and evaluating it ethically. All such boasting is evil. Right then, verse 17, we get in there. So he says, and here's the general principle that comes out of it all. Here's the point of his sermon, if you like. Whoever knows the good to do it and does not do it, for him it is sin. There's the generalizing aphorism, the general point being made out of the specific trading context that James has been imagining for us. And what James has done now is characteristic of the wisdom literature. He's saying, therefore. He's drawing an inference. He's making the connection with what's been already said. Since you now know better, you've been instructed to speak humbly, failure to act accordingly will constitute sin for you, because now you know better. Knowing, cognitive responsibility is tied directly to moral culpability. And the sequence is characteristic of wisdom and diatribe, all those patterns of speaking that we talked about earlier, and their moral teaching. James provided an exemplum, the merchant, the planner. He exposed the error by appealing to shared wisdom imagery. He prescribes corrected speech and attitude. And then he universalizes the discussion out into a universally applicable ethical principle. So what journey has this text traveled and brought us with it? Firstly, you had the topic, human planning, economic, future-oriented. Then he's got this focus, the illusion of control that underlies that versus an awareness of divine sovereignty. He's the one in charge. And then he's got a purpose, to reframe the hearer's speech and self-understanding in a God-centered rather than a man-centered mode. The sequence goes reproof, explanation, correction, evaluation, principle. See, you can read James 4:13 to 17 like it's disordered, like it's haphazard. But it's actually a well-structured thing, exposing, correcting, moralizing, self-confident human planning. And he's doing it in a format that's familiar to people's culture and understanding. This suits their ears. Now, he's not forbidding planning. He's reshaping the moral imagination underlying our plans. How we see them, their significance, their power, their potency, their ability to deliver. And what this teaches is that every plan we make must acknowledge both divine sovereignty and human fragility, alongside our ability to plan and act and do and be creative in the world in which we live. Creative of things and creative of a living as well. James is saying we've got to recognize we're mist, that our lives are vapor, appearing briefly before vanishing, and that therefore all our speaking about the future has got to be conditional. If the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. That's not in James's writing here. That's not in James's teaching here, merely about adding a pious phrase to our business proposals. It's about fundamentally reorientating how we understand what we're doing in business, how we understand our agency, our knowledge, and our place before God. It's about replacing the arrogant self-speech of self-sufficiency with the humble speech of dependence. And in that reorientation, discovering wisdom, because what we say to ourselves conditions the people we become. And the way to achieve this in practice, both in business and in life, is to live day by day, hour by hour, each business or life experience at a time, conversationally sharing each experience, thought and encounter with the living God himself, practicing his presence in conversational prayer. Well, as people who've sold or bought or whatever they've done here in this sale today make their way home, I'm winding up too. This is my word for the week. Hope it's of help to you. If I can be of any help to you, please feel free to hit me up in the messages. And don't forget to add, like, follow, share, whatever it is you can do. Thanks for listening in. God bless you. I hope you have a really good week. 12:52 gone with the Hepatah. 12:56 run.